our entire editorial team, I don't think any one of us had like a science background. We were all like, people from editorial and art backgrounds. And I think, I had people who were kind of writing and drawing comics for the magazine who also were people who had an interest in science, but were not necessarily people with a science background. So we had to sort of verify some of those details. Like if you're, like we had this ongoing series called Brinda the Tapeworm, in which this tapeworm sort of like slowly makes its way as the comic progresses, makes its way up to the brain, and then eventually sort of like you have this zombie kid who's being manipulated by this tapeworm, and and then all these crazy things happening, and the weird thing is, even something as out there as that, like we had to still make sure that the science is like somewhat accurate, like even you know so I don't know, maybe it does make the story a little better if it's if a little grosser, but like yeah.
As I was thinking through this episode, at least the 2-3 guests that I've talked to already, it is always easier to figure out how to define that arc. And with you, I had a bit of a unique challenge because as I was kind of, looking through what you've done, it's, a writer, an editor, an artist. Later, I found out a musician as well.
I mean,
Maybe the
amateur.
question is better posed to you, which is how would you kind of describe yourself or introduce yourself if someone kind of walked up to you at a party?
Well, it depends on who's asking, I suppose. But if I'm trying to get work out of them, and they're like in the industries, as it were, then I mean, I suppose either if they seem like the kind of people who could use some like branding input, then maybe I'd introduce myself as somebody who, I mean, as a designer basically, who works sort of end to end in the branding space, or maybe if they're in publishing, then I would talk about publishing. So I don't know, but I have this idea of, and I think at some point I mentioned this to you before, but this idea of like design being a sort of, and possibly I think the creative arts in general being a sort of continuum. So where I think you can put any of these things, and I feel like these are all sort of artificial silos. So once you kind of have I think once you have a sense of how the process works, how the design process works, or how the creative process works, I think it's pretty simple to sort of apply it to anything. And I think that extends also to learning these skills, because the same thing, I mean, fundamentally it's the same kind of thing, like the process. So, you learn a skill, then that will kind of predispose you to learn another skill, and then to apply that skill, and so on. So yeah, I mean, I don't know, I suppose I don't know. Like, it depends on who's asking.
The reason I kind of ask the question is because there's this, I guess, this fork in identity where you either, well, probably it's not a fork in identity. Maybe there are multiple personas where you're probably
Yeah,
either a generalist, and I'm guessing that's what you're leaning towards. I know I'm a bit of a
yeah,
generalist, where it's a combination of a bit of ADHD and kind of trying your hands at different things, and
yeah,
obviously, and
yeah,
the other one is being a specialist, right? Which is, I think,
yeah,
a large number of people kind of try to head down that path or innately fall into that bucket. And the reason I kind of
right.
wanted to kind of start the conversation there is because I know I'm a generalist in certain things that I do, but in
Yeah,
the, I guess, the hyper creative, at least the way I look at it, industry that you come from,
yeah.
I'm always curious whether being a generalist is far more difficult or it's a far smaller subset of people in the design, I guess, subset of people out there in the world to be like a
Yeah,
design generalist. So someone who can write, who can not only write, but I guess edit. And then you've got, the ability to kind of put images to words and kind of
yeah.
visually tell a story, not just write a story, and then put that into another kind of sensory experience, which is music. So, is that really kind of common, uncommon in the space that you kind of operate? I'm curious about that. Being a
I think
design generalist in its truest form.
so. I think it should be common. I think that's the answer, in the sense that I think even in design institutions and things like, when we plan curriculums, and actually that's how it was even when I was studying in design school, where like we we had a very healthy liberal arts program as well, and then we had a whole bunch of these sort of electives and minors that were in very very different kind of fields, like kinds of fields. So we had, you know, whatever, filmmaking or making music or theater or, you know, whatever it is. And I think the idea is, you know, as you're saying, to kind of make that person a sort of well-rounded individual who can kind of, you know, apply themselves in whatever direction necessary, or at least, you know, even if they're not good at all of these different things, at least to be able to kind of understand the perspective of like a practitioner in that industry enough to kind of work with them. Because, you know, these are, at the end of the day, like they are actually highly multidisciplinary like kind of areas. It's we think of it as, you know, when we, like when I was in college, it was basically like graphic design, furniture design, you know, textile design, so on. And like I think now those definitions have changed a fair bit over the last,
Hmm.
you know, 15 or 20 years, because now even in design schools, people are kind of, you know, they do recognize the fact that these are very multimodal kind of jobs. So, you know, you do have to apply yourself in many different areas. So yeah, I think, I mean, most of the like designers, and particularly the, you know, fairly successful ones that I know, are people who have uh, you know, skills in multiple areas. At a very basic level, it also just kind of, it doesn't work well, you know, in your, because you think that you may get a job just to do like a logo or an illustration or whatever, but then there is an entire other aspect to it. There are, like, you know, there are communication aspects to it that do rely on, you know, the written word, and, you know, presentation, like, you know, so if you've done a bit of theater, that feeds into your presentation skills. You know, if you're able to write well, that feeds in again to, you know, how well you sort of, you know, communicate your work, all of that. So I think it all kind of ties in. I think it does make sense to know a bit of all of this. I think, and it's the same, as I said, you know, it's the same process that you're kind of putting into all of this, like in the sense that, you know, any of these creative things, I think everything sort of begins, you have an idea, and then that kind of, you know, then there's a sketching or thumbnailing process, and then the sketches will then kind of get into, like, you know, the a sort of prototyping stage where you're iterating, and then the iterations will then eventually, you know, yield like two or three sort of finished designs, which then, you know, you present and kind of, and I think that that works in music, that works in art, it works in, you know, writing copy or whatever it is. um, it's kind of the same thing, I think. Does that answer your question?
No, it does. It does. I'm just wondering if that as a trait, as a discipline, or a special or a skill set is very common in the industry. Because you did say that the couple of the, I guess, the greats, you didn't use that term exactly, but people who really, that you seem to respect, do this really well, are able to kind of use this multimodal format to translate idea or vision onto something tangible, whether it's paper,
Yeah,
whether it's music, whether it's it, and to do it across multiple formats.
yeah,
But the path to get there is there, was that an incremental one? So so I do get that from a design philosophy and a foundational grounding, from an education point of view, that may be taught in your university or schooling, but then
right.
to kind of translate that into something that's practical,
Yeah,
one requires a fair bit of exercising that muscle that comes by
yeah,
doing. And the
yeah,
next question, which is, are you any good at it? Logic, or
yeah,
at least the industry will say, is that the market tells you whether you're good at it by determining how much you get paid for it, or if you get paid for it at all. Now,
yeah,
on that continuum of foundational understanding of a concept across design as a multimodal form, philosophy,
yeah,
to practicing it, to getting better at it, and then getting, and the eventual goal, which is, I know it's a very oblique way of looking at it, but market validation. How did
yeah.
that happen for you across all these formats, which is writing and visualization and music, and how did that kind of unfold?
Right. I mean, I think I'll start off with saying actually that in music, I'm very much at the early stages. So I wouldn't even bring that into this conversation, but I'm hoping to get there. But you know, as it's applying these same processes, I guess. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there is a learning curve, and I think there is also a curve in terms of like competency in these things. There is I need to get this right actually. I hope I remember this right. We used to have this like I had a teacher who used to kind of talk about this process in kind of learning and applying anything that, generally it's a good idea to sort of keep in mind. And how I'm assuming this is one of those Edward de Bono things, or, one of those, like, sort of lateral thinking type of guys, whoever it was, those gurus. I think one of them have come up with this thing, but how it's about how your sort of understanding of anything sort of begins at the stage of unconscious incompetence, where, you're incompetent and you're unconscious of I mean, you're not conscious of the fact that you're incompetent. Then, like, as you learn a skill, then you move from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence, I
Incompetence. Yeah.
think. And then that moves to, like, I'm definitely getting this wrong, but basically the steps are unconscious in incompetence, unconscious competence, conscious competence, and then sort of, generally, I think conscious competence is the last one. Yeah. So, eventually where you get to the place where you're very competent and you're applying it sort of consciously. I'm sorry if someone is listening to this who knows this, in a clearer way. This was years ago. It was like in 25 years ago in college that
So
we
some
were
things
kind
in
of
from
taught this thing.
university have not stuck clearly.
but but essentially the idea being moving from, like, unconscious incompetence to conscious competence is, like, is the goal.
Right.
And so, to kind of have that, build the skills, but also sort of building awareness of that. And there's a lot to it, I suppose. It's like saying, like, good readers are good writers. Half of it is really just sort of, like, exposing yourself to things where you're kind of learning, like, a lot of it is just sort of assimilating stuff, and then there is, of course, the practice side of things where you're actually putting that into. So, if you're not aware of, like, what is being done out there in terms of good illustration, or if you're not, like, fully aware of, like, the history of art and things like that, then that is something that you need to kind of fix and then eventually you move to actually sort of applying some of that in your actual skill building. But yeah, there is a process there, is what I meant to say. And you're right. I mean, each of these things, like, it does take some amount of experience. You need to kind of go out there, and if you have an interest in some of these things, you have to actually, like, try it out, actually go out there and do it, and be bad for a little while, like, not be aware that you're bad, and then be painfully aware that you're bad at what you're doing. And then, you have to kind of build your skills in some of these areas. And I've been there. I mean, I was, I mean, I probably still am, but I was an atrocious illustrator at one point. I'm certain I was a pretty bad writer at one point. Most of these things, like, I'm certain I was not the most diligent editor at one point. All of that, but then, just being out there making mistakes and then being painfully aware of them, that kind of fixes things. Yeah, it's always nice, actually, in a way, to kind of look back on your old work and actually, like, feel really horrible about it, and feel like, that cringe that you feel when you when you see your old work, that that, okay, maybe you are getting better. That's just that's the signal of.
So maybe that's a good place to maybe unpack it with, I guess, specific examples of your past that you can unpack, maybe. So
Okay.
and up to you to choose which example. Maybe two examples or three examples we can talk about. We haven't talked about what specific work you did. So Brainwave, the science magazine for kids, I really want to kind of get into, to kind of understand from that design arc and getting better at it, philosophy, how
Yeah.
Brainwave kind of evolved from where did the idea come from to how it evolved over time. Was it successful? Why it wasn't successful? I think that's
Yeah.
one great example I want to kind of get your help in unpacking. The second is
Right.
more on the commercial side, which is you talked about brand building and brand, the concepts of brand building.
Yeah.
So Brewski and Geist, and again we talked I think a while ago about the Asura, at least the Asura concept that you used rather
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
uniquely, to kind of in a way save or salvage, I guess, a brand identity or create a unique brand identity. That's probably a fairer way of
Yeah.
of kind of mentioning it. So maybe let's, from your point of view as a kind of as a creator, kind of walk me through that arc from concept to kind of something tangible in the world for first Brainwave maybe and Brewski, or either way,
Yeah.
and that'll be good to kind of understand from a designer's point of view how that kind of unfolds in the real world.
Okay. I think yeah, Brainwave actually is a like a good place to kind of start this. I think because
So what is Brainwave? If you can start with
yeah,
maybe just
yeah,
talking
I
about
can do that. Yeah.
what Brainwave was and then kind of go from there.
Right. Right. So Brainwave was a science magazine for, I would say, the age group that we had sort of defined was somewhere between 8 and upwards. And upwards could
Mm.
be, all the way to like teens, adults, whatever. But that was the age group, and so it was part of the ACK media stable at that point, which was like Amar Chitra Katha comics, Tinkle magazine, things like that. And then those people at that point, the Samir Patil, who then went on to start Scroll.in and Scroll Stack and things like that. He and Ashish Goel, who eventually went on to start Urban Ladder, and then now he started this company called Optimist. These two guys who had sort of, who had a background in sort of, engineering and then later in management and things like that. They kind of got together and they were kind of running ACK Media. Samir Patil, I think, had sort of acquired it from India Book House. And so ACK Media also included India Book House. I think, India Book House at that time was like the largest distributor in the country. And they wanted to, they had very ambitious plans for it, because for years and years, these publishing companies had been kind of going at a certain pace, but they wanted to kind of grow it in a big way. And one of the things they wanted to do was to kind of start a science magazine and then eventually sort of build it out in such a way that it becomes, they were very ambitious about it, to become a sort of science movement, and kind of get, kids everywhere around the country to sort of start thinking about science in a very qualitative way. Because there's always a sort of barrier to entry, right? Like in science, I think it's just because of how it was taught in schools. It has been taught in schools for like years and years. It's not a subject that, even though it's actually one of the most interesting subjects, is the way it's taught doesn't make it seem very interesting, just because of how the textbooks are, how the teachers sometimes are, and things like that. So this
Is it a
was
case?
meant.
Sorry to interrupt. Is it a case
Yeah.
of talking about the building blocks without talking about the castle as an end objective, and that's that's
Yeah.
that's what they wanted to flip on its head. So you kind of paint this the end objective, the
Yeah.
actual magical
Very
castle
much
at
so.
the
Yeah.
end,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then you work
Yeah.
backwards to what are the building blocks and turrets that you need to kind of eventually visualize this. Was
Yeah.
that,
That's a
to use a rough analogy, to
Yeah, that's a great analogy. That's very much what it was, really. I mean, my analogy was like far worse. I was going to say that it was meant to be like a gateway drug into science, but I suppose this is much prettier. What you just
as a parent to a 4.5-year-old and a 2-year-old, I'm already hyper tuned
yeah,
to the term drugs. So
yeah,
that's me over
yeah.
indexing.
Yeah, Magic Castle is better, I guess. But yeah, very much so. So where, for me, where that began was, so I had a background at that point in, like I had done, picture books and this and that, and I think for a brief while I was, and then yeah, for a little while I was working as in like journalism, actually, oddly enough. Excuse me. I was working for this magazine, which then kind of, I started out working there as a designer and illustrator, and then I started writing for them, and then I started editing for them, and then eventually that led to like me working as an editor at the Indian Express, and so on, and then that kind of, so I had this sort of, writing and editing background at that point, and then I was freelancing on the side as in design and stuff like that, and so randomly, I kind of came across this thing, and I ended up meeting Ashish, and so I think he was kind of intrigued by the fact that I had this sort of illustration and sort of fine art kind of and design background, but then I kind of moved into journalism. So he, like in the conversation we had, the question was whether you'd be able to handle something like this. So my pitch basically to him, because I didn't have a science background, but I had a massive interest in science in the sense that in popular science, I would read all the time and kind of I was very into it in general, not very in-depth like knowledge, but just sort of broad knowledge. And in school, the thing is, until maybe about like the ninth or tenth standard, I was hugely into it in the sense that like I really loved physics and biology and things like that. But I think where I was a little weak was in chemistry and maths. And then that ended up kind of shooting my like the whole science aspirations in the foot, and I ended up not getting into science. And I think this was a way for me also to sort of kind of get reacquainted with the subject. So I think my pitch to these guys was essentially that, listen, think of me as like, the sort of kind of reader that you want to appeal to, where, I have an interest in like broadly in science, but I don't know this enough. And like the textbooks and the school system have sort of put me off like deep learning. So maybe this is it's a good way for like somebody who's a lay person to kind of understand these concepts and then kind of translate that into good content. That might actually be a better way to do it than to get an expert to do it, because if you just straight away get a science editor who has a science background to kind of do this, then to run the magazine, then you end up again with the risk of it becoming a little too dense maybe. So that was like the proposition initially, and then they kind of, I mean, to their credit, they gave me a bit of time and space to kind of develop this and do this, how I sort of imagined it. And at that time, that point, I had a kind of a, I think just I had a network of peers in like design and art who are now some of the sort of best illustrators and so on, and writers and so on, working in the industry. And I kind of harnessed all these guys and kind of got them to, I mean, because often it's like the quality of the content is really dictated by the team that's kind of working on it. So I kind of it built out this sort of really good team of people who would bring in like regular content. And so over the course of a year, we kind of built out a like this whole thing, and I think we launched about a year after my initial conversations with these guys. So that ran for like a few years after that. I was involved with it for the first, I think, about 2.5 volumes, which was about maybe 25, 30 issues or so. But essentially, each issue kind of worked exactly like this, where there was very much a solid learning curve. You were talking about that earlier, about whether these processes are and how this sort of like how you kind of go from not knowing anything to kind of then building some skill in it. So actually, it really helped me learn a lot of basic concepts as well, because and the way we approached each of these things was also in interesting ways. Like when we wanted to do a physics issue on light, instead of doing that, we kind of looked at it from the perspective of invisibility. Like how do you kind of mess with light in order to kind of create invisibility, or like or if you want, rather than just having an issue on gravity, we did an issue on flight, and things like that. We had a lot of fun, interesting issues. We had like an entire issue on like movie visual effects, for instance, where like it had like King Kong on the cover, and like inside was just full of like, and we had like we showed kids how to make like stop motion animations and all kinds of things. It was great fun. So yeah, that was, I mean, that kind of very much followed that sort of a process. Sorry, I want to just kind of like refresh and go back to your original question. So,
No,
um,
no, that's fine. So
yeah,
the idea was to kind of walk through maybe two or three examples, and I think the
yeah,
brainwave one is great for a variety of reasons. One, I love science just as you do,
yeah,
and the fact that I'm at the stage where I have young kids, and you're at the stage where there are five why questions to everything you tell them, right? So
yeah,
the neuroelasticity of a child is just so great,
yeah,
and you
yeah,
want to kind of find creative ways to not shut doors. And what you just talked about, which is the whole reason I guess brainwave was put together, and the way the team was put together was essentially to get, I guess, a 15-year-old or a 12-year-old Vinayak excited about
That was exactly that.
science without having chemistry and math get in his way.
Well,
So
I
so
kind of
kind of
ended up
looking at
loving chemistry and maths as well through the course of brainwave, actually. So
great. So I mean,
that
it's
was,
like
yeah,
it's like a redemption arc that you have a full kind of circle. But very curious to
yeah,
kind of double click on that, which is you have these bunch of illustrators and creative artists, people who come at this from a very out of the box kind of thinking, but
yeah,
you still have to kind of root this back in science. And the two
right,
examples that you talked about, which I really love, which is how do you talk about light, but then you talk about it from the point of how do you become invisible, which again already sets a I want to know how to become invisible. So then you're
yeah,
already pre-wiring kids to kind of want to kind of unpack that problem, as with learning to fly. And again, the foundational I guess physics here is gravity and math.
yeah,
So
yeah,
how did the team kind of decide on what to talk about, and
yeah,
whether there was a need to kind of in some way connect it back to the curriculum, as it were, because
right, yeah, because that
how
is
did
a
this
consideration,
how did
yeah,
this sell, yeah, how did this sell in the market, which
yeah,
I'm guessing was it through primarily through schools or through parents? Like, who was the decision maker on the customer side that said
right,
this is a fascinating perspective that my kids really need to kind of learn it this way or
yeah.
this way as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think I mean it's a question that poses a lot of problems actually in the publishing space in India all the time, even now actually, which is that one of the big issues is distribution. So I think when you're talking about it from the customer side of things, it's the customer. The customer needs to know that the product exists before they can buy it. And one of the big problems is, and at least it was at that point, this is back in like between 2010 and 2013 or so. Um, uh, if you send out copies, and India Book House at that point was the biggest distributor in the country, and all the copies would be sent out to all the tier one and tier two cities in India. And these issues and I think there was a certain amount that was reserved for subscribers. It took us a long time to build a subscriber base because first people, again, they need to know that the magazine exists before they can subscribe. And I think at the time we didn't probably have a lot of the social media channels weren't as sort of advanced, then
Hmm.
as they are now. Was Instagram around then? I don't know.
I doubt
I
it.
think it
I
was,
doubt
I
it.
think it
No.
was Facebook mostly. And Facebook,
Hmm.
I don't think they were like, I mean, obviously even now they're not supposed to be there, but there weren't like kids on it. And so back then, these copies would be sent through India Book House. They'd end up in these go downs, and then there was a sales team who would have to go and sell it to various newsstands and bookstores. And so the big challenge over there was, the thing is, it's not through any fault of theirs, but like, most of the sales team were not sort of highly conversant in English, and this was an English magazine. So translating some of these concepts, when you go and they have to kind of go and hand sell these copies to, shops and ask them to kind of place it out front so that people will see it and buy it. And the shopkeeper mentality in this thing is always that, what sells well already is what is going to keep selling. So they'll keep the best sellers out in front. And then the new things are just sort of hidden away in the back. So the discoverability is very, very limited unless you actually go and push them to do that. And I would do that. I would every time I would visit various cities. Like I had to kind of go. We had I'd go around sort of meeting scientists and things like that to kind of get some consultation on some of the content and things like that. And every time I would travel around, I would make it a point to basically spend like at least a day going to bookstores and then telling them, listen, do you have copies of Brainwave firstly? And if they don't, then I have to call the distribution team and say, listen, there is a store here that doesn't have copies. And then if they do have copies, then they very sheepishly say, yes, yes, we have 3, 4 copies, and it'll be like in the back, like hidden away behind like a bunch of tinkles or whatever. And I'll have to tell them, okay, listen, you've kept like 4 tinkles side by side here. Can you please take like just one issue of Brainwave and keep it in front along with these things so that people know that
Right.
this thing exists? And eventually, so it takes a while. And Anant Pai, who kind of started ACK and Tinkle and so on, he had kind of told me at some point that any of these magazines, it will take like a good 5 years of sort of doing this kind of hand selling and going out there and kind of really pushing it in order for it to make it. And if you don't last, I mean, if that doesn't work, then you don't typically last beyond about 5 years, which is what happened sadly to Brainwave. It was at the end of the day, it was a sort of, I think there was a failure in distribution at multiple levels. And also, I mean, there were various considerations. There were multiple like management changes and things that put an end to that magazine. But in initial stages, this was one of the challenges. And the other thing, as you were saying, what are the other ways? I think institutional sales was a main thing because that's another place where kids end up discovering things. So we had to kind of go and talk to various schools and so you have to get past the principals first, but you have to talk to the principals and then convince them to kind of keep the magazine first in the libraries, like a few copies in the library, so that the kids can read it. And then if there are enough kids reading it, then you kind of ask them, okay, can we do like a subscription drive here? Can we maybe do like a workshop or an event here? And then kind
Right.
of push that. We also then started doing things like we already had a science advisory board for the magazine, which had a set of sort of established scientists and educators and things like that on it. And so we would kind of send each issue to them to sort of vet and then kind of also do a postmortem afterwards and just see if it was all okay and where we can get better. But similarly, we also started a similar program with kids. We had these school advisory boards like comprised of student advisory board actually. And they would also kind of send in, like we tell them in advance, like 3 issues in advance that, okay, 2, 3 issues from now, we're going to be doing something on material science. And so, if you have any ideas, send something in. Or if you, like, we had a DIY, like a DIY section. We had, like comics and this and that. So if you have anything in mind for some of these, then send it in. So we had like content coming in, and I think that also sort of generates interest because kids will like they'll send their content, and then they'll obviously then if it's printed, they'll want to tell all their friends that my thing is there in this magazine. And these are all sort of organic ways in which you kind of spread the that information. Yeah, it was a big task. I mean, in the sense that, like, on the one hand, sort of, uh, like focusing on the editorial and content was there was a lot of work there, but the real work really, because that once you kind of put a system in place, and once you have a team in place, and have like a content structure and things like that, that's actually the easy part.
Hmm.
Like if you have good people involved, that the content side of things is actually the easy part. The real like hassle is the distribution side of things. And in India, everything, there's bureaucracy also in everything. Like IBH, for instance, it's age old, like I think when we were kids and things like that, it was like India Book House who used to distribute like everywhere. And they, like the I think at that time, I mean, not to like sort of slight anyone involved in the thing, but a lot of the employees and a lot of the different cities were probably as old as the company at that point, and they would just sort of sit on these piles of copies, like 5,000 copies would be sent to this one go down, and then suddenly I'll find like 3 weeks later, I'll call and I'll speak to the distribution people, and I'll find out that like those copies are still sitting in the go down and they haven't left. So you have to like then kind of go and light a fire under somebody's ass and kind of get these copies moving. And so it's just a whole thing. I mean, these are things that I did not expect to kind of have to get into at any point in my life, but you end up living and learning, I guess.
Well, I guess it goes hand in hand being a generalist, right? So if
Yeah,
you
yeah,
think of this as, in a way, starting a business, and while
yeah,
Brainwave was just a, I guess, well, not just it was it was a it was a magazine under the auspices of a very very large publishing house.
yeah,
It still
yeah,
was essentially in a way a startup, right? At least that's the
yeah,
analogy that I can draw from it. I think
yeah,
maybe the not the lesson here, but I guess the self-evident, what do you call, insight is that just as the team took a very contrarian view to getting heavy, for some people, science material to them in a manner that's easy to digest, by taking this very very different view on how to kind of communicate concepts, which is the foundational idea behind Brainwave.
yeah,
I think it also probably merited a foundational rethink on your go-to-market strategy. And you talked about
Mm.
some elements of how you guys did it, which is the student councils, which I think is brilliant. Because at the end of the day, you're not creating another science magazine, right? So if you were creating another science magazine, the existing routes to market or another Tinkle,
Yeah,
there's a great fit. But from what
yeah,
you're telling me, it seemed that there was a bit of a dichotomy between the kind of content you were creating and
yeah,
who the sellers ought to have been and how you
yeah.
had to get them into the hands of the eventual buyers. Because in a way, it was a category that didn't exist. Or was there something similar to Brainwave when you guys were doing it?
There were, I mean, like there had been magazines in the past, and there were, like here, not really. I would say no, because so in the past there were great magazines that kind of, I think, just in terms of like ethos, there were magazines that kind of were in like the same sort of general kind of a like area, which was, early. I think so. There was Quest. Do you remember Quest?
Yep, yep,
From
yep.
like way back. So there was Quest, and there was like Quest and Junior Quest, I think, and the whole. I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, I like early in the morning, and I'm yet to have breakfast. So I'm kind of struggling to
Yeah,
remember
so
some of these names. But then, but there were. I mean, there were. But the thing is, I think what wasn't really there was like a focused science magazine that kind of was not so much geared specifically to kind of drive kids to the textbooks or kind of, or it wasn't meant to sort of append whatever was already in the textbooks, like something that was just a general interest science magazine. That
yep.
was not really there at that point. And I think also just in terms of the quality of the content and so on, I think we in many ways we made our own jobs quite difficult, because one way of doing this could have been really to just kind of use this, all the existing Tinkle characters and so on, and kind of do like
Mm, yep.
a Tinkle add-on, so it could have just been like a Tinkle science magazine, and which was something that we discussed early on. And that I think would have been easier to sell as well, because at the shops they
So,
already know
so
these
curious
characters.
about that. Why wasn't that picked up on? Because the biggest thing is, I think a lot of people talk about this, right? Um,
Yeah,
Creating a brand is massively expensive. It is massively time
yeah,
consuming,
correct.
regardless
Yeah,
of how good the quality of the product is. And you know this because you've built
yeah,
brands, or at least
yeah,
designed brands from the ground up. So I'm
yeah.
curious, why didn't that happen? Like what was the
So
pushback to say, oh shit, we own the assets. This would be a great segue over to a new category,
yeah.
leveraging a well-established brand in the market that already has outstanding penetration in the target segment that we're going after.
Yeah. I mean, you're completely right, and I wish you were part of those conversations back then. But I think we were all like, I think there was generally a lot of like confusion in this kind of thing, because it was very much a too many cooks situation. Because we had, so at that time ASK Media had, it had Tinkle, it had Amachita Katha, it had Karadi Tales, which the children's book company based out of Chennai. They were also at that time part of Amachita Katha. It had Brainwave, it had, so and then there was the IBH team and all of that. And because a new property was being started at that point, there were like these larger level conversations included everyone from every team, and there was a lot of
Mm,
input and there was a lot of noise. And I think there was a fair bit of worry also on the one hand of like, how are we going to kind of incorporate these? And then once you kind of use these existing characters, people like whatever Shikari Shambhu and Supandi and all of these things, like would this then would we sort of from the content side of things, would we then be a bit constrained by the sort of world building and structures that already existed around
mm,
these characters, in the sense that if you use a Supandi, which will we then, is that entire section that kind of includes him, uh, be limited to like a certain kind of story where like, there's this guy who's just sort of stumbling his way through life and like very sort of Mr. Bean kind of character. And then every single time we have to kind of do this thing where there's this massive learning curve, and then, maybe he doesn't learn anything at all, but like something funny happens, and, all of that. Maybe that's not the route we want to take. I then said, I think I liked the general idea of using characters to kind of tell these stories. I didn't want to be, I think, really constrained by them. Maybe, in hindsight, I do think maybe it was a mistake. I think maybe we could have at least used two or three of these Tinkle characters and kind of, pushed it that way. But what I ended up doing was I ended up creating a set of characters just for Brainwave. So I had this set of characters called the Smarties, which were this very strange kind of bunch of kids. And I think somebody in the someone real life scientists to be part, like to be included in this in the characters, like and said they said like why not like some in like great Indian scientists like Aryabhatta and then like you can do Einstein and things like that. So I was like I kind of I created there's this story that I came up with where like there's this, it's very strange, but there's this like elderly Toda woman who in the Nilgiris, like in this mountain, like who's she's got this long white beard and stuff, this old bearded lady. And who's this like amazing scientist, like who no one knows about. And she's working in this like cave somewhere in the Nilgiris. And she's accompanied by this, like the only living dodo in the world, like who's this little dodo called Dr. Dodo. And so Dr. Dodo and the Toda lady is called Scree, I think. Like, so both of them kind of, try to create this, they come up with a time machine and and they kind of create this thing to kind of bring back these like famous scientists to kind of help with problems that are there in the world today.
Hmm.
And then they mess up their calculations a little bit, and these scientists come back, but they come back like it's the child versions of them who end up
Oh,
end
very
up being
cool.
pulled into the future. So you have like little Albert Einstein and little Aryabhatta, who are basically, I think, RB and Albi, and then there was, so there's a bunch of these weird characters, and like they kind of go on these adventures. So every issue we had these things happening where like so we had one like the energy issue, for instance, was it began with it had this elaborate like comic where it started with Dr. Dodo being kind of stuck in the past because he's kind of used the time machine, gone there, and then now like whatever energy like that this thing is kind of running on, it was depleted. So he kind of leaves like a message on the cave wall. So which like whatever 2,000 years later or 3,000 years later, the current day like Smarties team will have to kind of read and interpret, and then they have to then use like the smaller time machine there, which has only a certain capacity to kind of send back like a certain amount of like that energy to kind of thing. And so thing is like this thing can't carry that payload or whatever. So then they have to then go and research all the different forms of energy and find what is like the right kind of energy to kind of thing. So we at that point we were talking to so I'd gone and met like the scientists at the National Chemical Laboratory in Pune. And we spent some time, and we were actually planning this material science issue that was going to come up like a couple of issues later. So I asked them if they had some ideas on like ways in like uh, compact forms of energy. And somebody I think was doing some research into how crystals can be used to kind of like hydrogen is a like a viable form of energy, but I think there's a lot of space between the atoms or whatever. So like the
Hmm.
crystals kind of condense them and kind of hold them in an efficient way. So that was the theory they were working off. And I don't know how I arrived at this, but like I think it was based on their science. But like for some reason, like in the end of the comic, like basically Dr. Dodo harnesses like something from guano, like bat guano, kind of then kind of like come back into the present or whatever. So this is the whole thing. But in the middle of that, like we had several spreads, which like one spread was on like nuclear energy, one was on like wind and solar and this and that. And so it was a nice way to sort of talk about energy and how that works and conservation and so on, and then kind of tie it together with this story. So the characters actually ended up working quite well. It's just I think, as you were saying, from a brand exercise, you have to, like, if you think of these as branding like properties, like mascots or whatever, it does take time to kind of build interest in these
Hmm.
these characters. And yeah, maybe that was a mistake in not using existing Tinker characters. I think we initially, before the first issue of Brainwave started, I think we tried to kind of popularize these characters by putting out like a couple of one-off comics in Tinkle, so that kids who are already reading Tinkle could then kind of see that okay, there are these new characters, and then they can engage with them in this new magazine. I don't know how well that worked. I think towards the end we were maybe selling like I'm not sure, maybe like 30,000 copies at most. Couldn't have been like much more than that, I think. But
So I
then,
so so I sorry.
yeah.
I'm going to double click on that.
Yeah.
There's a lot for me to kind
Yeah,
of wrap my
sorry.
head around because
Yeah.
but no, but it's really fascinating because it lends itself very nicely to both my interest of science as well as all things wacky. And I'm
Right.
very, very curious about how you essentially have to marry those two things, right? So, one
Yeah.
is the book, at least each article talked about a specific concept. We talked about nuclear energy or particle physics or
Yeah.
light or whatever. So,
Yeah.
the foundational elements of that arc had
Yeah.
to be grounded in science, right? I mean, in actual
Yeah.
working science. And
Yeah.
then you had to marry this with this really abstract, wacky, no frame of reference characters that you had to kind of concoct, which is I'll be coming back from the past. And these are
Yeah.
really, really interesting story arcs by themselves without
Right.
the scientific aspect. So I'm kind of
Yeah.
curious about how that process actually works because you have to do two things. You're not, and it has to culminate. There's a point of the story. It has to end. The arc has to end somewhere where there is some
Yeah.
learning.
Yeah.
What is that process like? Like, how long does it take? Over how many iterations? Is it a lot of people dumping into that pot of creativity where someone on the side is basically saying, "Hey, you guys are straying away from the science." Like, I'm very curious about how this kind of this messiness kind of unfolds because it seems messy to me, just kind of
Yeah.
thinking through the process. But maybe there's something that's really structured that you're accustomed to.
Yeah. So, I think there is a I mean, so there's this whole field of like narrative design, and I think narrative design essentially kind of, it's this thing of like how do you kind of use narrative to kind of tell what are essentially just sort of very utilitarian kind of like pieces of communication that you need to get across, but how do you kind of build narratives and worlds to kind of make it a little more engaging? And I think it uses essentially like the same principles as like just classical like like Aristotelian like storytelling principles. So you have like a certain narrative arc. You begin with a certain status quo, and then there is a like a high point in that arc, and then in the end like there is a learning and so on, and then you come back to that status quo, but like now you have and these are kind of structures that are present in everything from the Odyssey to like the Ramayana to whatever it is. In the case of like things like this, where again the challenge here, for instance, I'll give you another example. This is like so a couple of issues later, as I was saying, we did this thing on material science, and so we had, there were, so we were working with these scientists at the National Chemical Laboratory in Pune, and they had a bunch of things that they wanted to talk about. But the challenge was kind of trying to make it interesting for kids. So they sent us a whole bunch of these concepts that like things that they were working on in their labs. So you have to slightly kind of work at it a little backwards. So you arrange these concepts and see what are like common elements. And I think the idea that so we had a team that sort of worked on these things. The idea we came up with was essentially forensic science is actually at the base of it. It kind of there is a logic is a big part of it, but a lot of it is essentially chemistry. And we were working with the chemical laboratories, and so so I was saying, why don't we kind of do something where like we create a detective story, because detectives kind of use forensics to solve crimes, and we kind of create like this sort of elaborate crime kind of thing, and then include all these things along the way as things to be solved, and then which eventually leads them to kind of solve the whole thing. And so this was, I mean, I just kind of proposed this idea, but then there was this, I think that particular story was, I think, written by Rajita Gadadkar, who was one of the senior editors in the team. And she kind of created this crazy story where like there were uh there's a series of islands, and like I think it begins with like something happening on this one island. I don't remember exactly what, and then like this one of the characters has to solve these crimes, so they do go island hopping. And on each of these islands there's something strange like that's happening in each of these islands, and everywhere like she has to solve these kind of things, but it's all, I think, at every island, like what the problem that was being created was like one of the uh, I can't like remember exact things like concepts that we were kind of talking about. It was like way back, like it was 12 years ago, or whatever. But it's all of it is up. Like we have a brainwave archive on archive.com, so these are things that like anyone can go and read. But stuff like that, where we kind of like we see what is a common kind of a thread to this whole concept, and then and try and kind of find a parallel kind of thing in like existing fiction and so on, and then we try and map it to that kind of an idea,
Okay.
and then kind of use just classical narrative techniques to build it out. So same way like the energy thing, it was just like a standard like Back to the Future kind of time travel thing. you know that was just the framework within which you then kind of slot all of these. I don't know how successful we were in the sense of like like in terms of making it very organic, but for the purposes of what we were doing, at the end of the day, it's a sort of didactic kind of a thing. It's to reduce that didactic element that we kind of bring in the story element. But it was, I think, again, once you have the characters, once you have the world in place, it's actually fairly easy.
Yeah, I can understand how it's, yeah, once you've got those foundational elements that don't really change as much, and you've kind
Yeah.
of understood the I guess you have to be an expert at storytelling in a way. So you need to know how to kind of start, get to the middle, and then finish, and then connect it to the context of your reader, which is in this case kids of a specific age group. So the kind of the way the characters communicate and the little quirks that need to have to make them interesting,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
I guess change. Which is why Albert Einstein, as a child, makes more sense than bringing Albert Einstein as a in his prime back to an
Yeah.
audience of, I guess, 5 to 12 year old kids.
Yeah. It's kind of it's sort of like a good example of like how this has worked really well, I think, in publishing is actually the Asterix series. So the
Yep.
Asterix series is essentially this, right? It begins with you open it, like you have these characters that are shown, and you have the character Bible right there on the first page. It says like whatever Asterix, indomitable warrior with whatever, and then Getafix who does this, and Obelix who whatever drank a lot of magic potion as a kid and this and that. And then so you immediately know, even if you pick up like you've never read any Asterix comic, you've picked up one of the comics in the middle, now these are the characters, what they're about. You don't really need to know like the history of France or whatever to kind of get into it. But then once you get into these books, like they're actually talking about real historical things that were happening at that point. It's just that it's very cleverly done. It's a lot of comedy, it's a lot of fun, but it's like you're learning history when you're reading this stuff. So I think though, every one of those follows the same arc. There's a problem
Right.
presented in the beginning, and then like they go on a journey. There's like a quest, and then it ends back in the village where there's a feast in the end. So there's a very predictable ending that's going to happen. The musician gets thrown out, and then everyone else sits and eats wild boar, and there's a whole. So it's a
So
repetitive thing. I think kids like the repetition as well. So
I guess, yeah. I mean, if
yeah,
there's if there's a not, I mean, I guess the if you have to if you have too much cognitive overload, and you have to
yeah,
carry, like, for example, storylines which have too many characters, or the story
yeah,
arc is
yeah,
too
yeah,
complicated, or there are too many
yeah,
folks that you need to keep a memory of, which
yeah.
is, well, the fantasy books that I'm used to reading. Well, when I got much older, you had more
Yeah, yeah.
complicated story arcs, you had sub arcs and subplots, and it
Yeah,
tended to
yeah.
get
All
a bit
your Wheel
of
of Time and all of that stuff.
correct. So a lot more heavy cognitive lifting that
That's true.
I guess doesn't lend itself to as much stickiness. You really have to be bought into those worlds and those story
Yeah,
plots to really power through and carve out, I guess, mind space for those kind of subplots and remember
yeah.
them over a long period of time. So I'm curious about the last bit of this, which is, now I have an understanding of the creative process, the structure to kind of put images to words and then marry a relatable story arc or an interesting story arc with foundational science concepts. But
Hmm.
how did it land with the kids at the end? Because you said there were about 20,000 kind of readers. In a country that's as large as India,
Yeah,
where there is a culture, at least in that period, there was still a culture of a lot of reading, a lot of books. And
yeah,
again, Twinkle, I'm guessing the volumes were massive. Um,
yeah,
the
yeah.
so is it so? How do you, as a designer, know if all the effort that you've put in to kind of marrying these two worlds that shouldn't be sitting together, which is science and a bit of parody in a way,
Yeah.
if they land well with your audience or not, and if it's sticky
So
enough for them to come back for the next issue, for example, using the asterisks analogy that you used.
yeah. I mean, the feedback system is something is the thing that kind of I think does sort of evolve over time, and I don't know whether we kind of, I mean, it lasted long enough for it to become like as robust as it could have been, like in the sense that I think Tinkle and so on, they would receive like, just an extraordinary amount of mail and things, that reader mail and things that we did get. Like we used to get letters and things, and I think that's one of the ways in which magazines kind of get reader feedback. You rely on
Right.
like letters to the editor, and there. So there was that, and then of course, we'd go to schools and kind of actively ask kids and things like that. There is I think, you know, like there's a danger also of relying too much on like feedback from kids.
Hmm.
There is good feedback, but then like at the end of the day you also slightly need to trust yourself in terms of like your
True.
storytelling capabilities. So because I think if you do it like in an engaging enough way, and if I think it's the same thing that applies for like kids or grown-ups. I mean, if it's a fun story, I think people will kind of enjoy it either way. And I think we did rely a fair bit even on, we had a the thing is also we had a lot of seasoned storytellers in the publishing company itself. So, we would also like, there were the kids, but then, these are people who had been working on children's content for years and years. So we would send out like these copies every issue to also to, editors of the various like, like Tinkle and Amachita Katha and all of that. And they would all kind of read and give feedback as well. And they knew this market really well. And I think if they were happy with it, I think we were kind of like, fairly happy. The thing that I think we used to be always scared of was what the scientists would say. And because
Really?
yeah, I mean in the advisory board and so on, because we'd worry that like they'd think we're making light of some of these things and maybe not kind of or maybe the story was kind of obfuscating the like the core concept, or actually the worst case scenario would have been to just like make big errors, which we have. I think
So,
one or two times we have sort of made some mistakes and then we had to go and correct it and things like that. But yeah, the feedback mechanism, I think it's something that it takes a few years, I think, to develop like a really robust kind of feedback mechanism from readers. I don't think we got there in the time that the magazine
right.
ran. Now, nowadays I think things would be a lot different because of all the different sort of channels of communication that exist outside of just the like email and so on. So
Right.
I don't know.
So
I don't know
I,
how it would.
I'm going to play probably devil's advocate, and I'm wondering,
Yeah,
picking up on what you said just a couple of minutes ago about
yeah,
the I guess the scientific board or the science
yeah,
board of advisors that you had.
yeah.
Is it is the reason why there was so much of a I guess focus in ensuring that they were happy with the end product, a function of the way the publishing houses kind of operated in the past, and that was just the model. So you have these kind of advisory boards, and then they played a heavy role or have played some sort of heavy emphasis on whether the product was quote unquote good in the eyes of the
Mm,
publishing house. Was that the reason why that was so important? Because I would think, especially given the slightly contrarian view that Brainwave took, which was
mm,
essentially to kind of instill the love of science in kids, especially at
mm.
that age, I would assume, again, this is just my perspective. Getting
Yeah,
the specifics right isn't as important as is instilling a general love for the subject, because you have a lifetime and you have your regular school to kind of really pick up the specifics, right? You're not. I would it'd be unlikely for you for Brainwave to become, where you learn quantum physics
yeah,
in all its glory, right?
yeah,
Or the refractive index of of the various wavelengths of light and stuff like that. But it
yeah,
would. But I'm guessing the idea essentially en masse is to say that if, and this is the way I would kind of look at success metrics purely as an outsider listening to your story and understanding the context of Brainwave, is that
yeah,
in a classroom of 25 kids,
yeah,
before there was Brainwave, there were 7 that really wanted to know something about science, and now they're
yeah,
15. And
Right.
isn't honestly that the only metric that really matters? And I'm just playing devil's advocate again,
No, no,
having no skin in the game.
you're absolutely right. I think I would probably advocate for the same devil. Like this is a thing that I think, I think the leaders in the organization, I mean, like, above like us, like, I think the business people in particular were, I think, a little, like the publishers and so on, I think were kind of worried about like this thing that maybe, if we kind of put out like some wrong information or whatever it is, like,
Mm,
if I don't know if it might kind of have some sort of backlash, I think, because, finally, if you are doing things like institutional sales and like school sales and things like that, you need
fair
to,
point.
yeah, there's a trust element, right? So you need to convey that, okay, there are like trusted names who are backing this thing, and we are not just sort of like, talking through our ear ends, like, there is some credibility to this thing. So I think to convey that credibility is why we had to build this team. But at the end of the day, I mean, initially it did, I think. So I mean, that is a cynical way of looking at it, but, and I think maybe in the beginning, like that proposal also did have a sort of cynical element to it. But I think once we kind of built out the team, because a lot of these are people who I actively sort of, spent a fair bit of time with and went and had conversations with, and so on. And, some like couple of people who actually even taught me and things like that. So there were, this board of educators and scientists and so on. They're very engaged after a point. So, uh, there's one group in particular. There's this group of scientists who are running like a science outreach thing among various schools in Bangalore. They're called Curious City. I think now they have a huge science center somewhere in the outskirts of Bangalore, and they were particularly engaged group who kind of, gave us a lot of input in each issue. And I think so there was a qualitative difference that they did make, and we even had like clashes and things like that here and there. And I think those were good. I find, I think friction is always a good thing, because I feel like friction sort of leads to growth. And I think it kind of, like, those kind of arguments are always great in terms of like, making certain processes neater and better over time. But yeah, I think, you're right in the sense that from the point of view of this being like, the gateway drug to science, as I say earlier, but like but this being like the, as you were saying, that sort of pretty castle of science that you're kind of showing to these kids. These are maybe like petty considerations. Maybe we didn't really need to kind of, look at the sort of nitty-gritties. But yeah, I suppose, in a very general sense, it was a thing of conveying trust in the brand. That was one of the main reasons. And I think just to kind of make ourselves feel good about the fact that we kind of got something right, because at the end of the day, as I was saying, our entire editorial team, I don't think any one of us had like a science background. We were all like, people from editorial and art backgrounds. And I think, I had people who were kind of writing and drawing comics for the magazine, who also were people who had an interest in science, but were not necessarily people with a science background. So we had to sort of verify some of those details. Like if you're, like, yeah, we had this ongoing series called Brinda the Tapeworm, in which this tapeworm sort of like slowly makes its way, like as the comic progresses, makes its way up to the brain. And then eventually sort of like you have this zombie kid who's being manipulated by this tapeworm, and and then all these crazy things happening. And the weird thing is, even something as out there as that, like we had to still make sure that the science is like somewhat accurate, like even
Sound.
so I don't know, maybe it does make the story a little better if it's if a little grosser, but like yeah.
So I'm wondering, was this? It was a science magazine that was trying to make science more relatable, right? I mean, that was the idea. It was still
Yeah.
within the realm of science magazines, right? That's the way it was pitched, even to schools.
Yeah, I would say that.
So
I
so
mean, I think it's just to, or like in a broader sense, to just kind of make the idea of scientific thinking like, I mean, to give that more, I think to give that more context. I think the thing is, I think like we kind of, because we're put into these silos of like science and commerce and so on in school, that we lose sight of the fact pretty early on that science is essentially in everything, and everything we
correct. So
do
that
has like a science to it. And I think this was
So
just
that
the idea was just to highlight that, the fact that
right,
like you are science, you are in science, you are participating in science like constantly. So
right. So my I think what I was trying to work my thinking process through was, is it a
yeah,
question of where this found a home? So it was a science magazine that was trying to make science more relatable, and as a result you had, the conversations with the schools had to meet a certain, I guess, hygiene criteria or hygiene threshold.
yeah,
Your
that's a good way to
board
put it.
had to have a certain number of scientists and educators on board. So while it was the theme was the differentiator was fun, the
Mm.
gateway was still the science, right? I mean, to get into all these schools, and that was the conversation with the educators. But
Yeah,
if this was bucketed as purely, let's say, another Tinkle, another
yeah,
fun kind of magazine where you
yeah,
just so happen to learn science along the way, would you
yeah.
do you think that the approach would have been very, very different? And the longevity of the product might have been, because at the end of the day, kids really don't, as we get older, because of neuroelasticity, we start thinking more rigidly.
Mm.
The creative types like you probably not as much, but
No,
people like us.
no, man. You're very much so. Like I'm pretty sure. I think my students in like college and so on are probably like they have like much more interesting ideas than I do. Yeah. So yeah, you're right. I mean,
Correct.
our thinking does get sort of ossified as we get older. Yeah,
As we
for
get
sure.
older. So but the point I'm trying to make
Yeah.
is that if you kind of visualize a gateway to the world, and you said it right, science is just the world. If you think about just visually think about this as a huge house with about 10 doors, we think about
Yeah.
science in one and economics in one, and these are the gateway, the entries into that world. They're all the same world, but a
Yeah.
kid
Yeah.
thinks very differently, right? So we might have
Yeah.
10 doors, a kid has 1,000 doors. They
Yeah.
really don't care about which door they open. They really care
Yeah.
that their wonders once they open the door and what's on the other side, right? So
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
wondering if reframing this as a just another Tinkle, and
Yeah.
doubling down on the fact that it was just a cool comic, and
Yeah.
that's where the virality was, right? So virality in our generation, and even not so long ago, was not Instagram and Facebook. It's basically a friend looking at you reading a comic book or a book magazine and saying, "Hey, what is that? Can I borrow it?" And that's how virality. I mean, that's the
True.
OG virality, right? And,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah. Yeah.
probably, you would have probably seen sales at a far higher level. I don't know. I could be completely wrong because it's never happened. That we'll never know. But I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right in the sense. So, I often ask myself this thing of, so for me, Brainwave was actually one of the like the most fun things that I've worked on, and I think in many ways it was probably one of the most successful things, just in terms of not as a like in terms of sales, like not from the business side of things, but I think it was one of the most successful things I've worked on in terms of like creating content that kind of works in a certain way, and like there was a lot of work that went into that, and I often think of, if I think of this thing of, if I were to kind of go back and start or even now, if I were to start a magazine for kids again, like, how would I sort of approach it? And I think uh, Mm, I probably wouldn't even kind of, keep it like limited to science. I would probably, think of it as a more sort of, maybe knowledge in a very broad way. Where, because while I was talking about, not wanting to kind of, conform to these silos that we talk about in education, like I, at the end of the day, by calling ourselves a science magazine, we did sort of put ourselves into a
Mm,
silo. Whereas there are so many other, like, even like like historiography in general for like science, it kind of like you have to then think of like which we did have, like we kind of talked about a lot of science history within the magazine, but that kind of has to like is lives in the broader context of human history, and then that kind of that kind of sits in the broader context of like how geographical forces, like, and kind of like geographical kind of things in like things that inform the geography of the planet kind of work a certain way, and then about how humans have moved across the planet and all kinds of things. There's a whole lot of like there are so many layers to the experience of like of living, that I think we kind of, by talking by saying this is a science thing, we are kind of limiting ourselves even there. So I would have sort of broadened that out, and then maybe use narrative to kind of talk about all of this. And And you're right. I mean, I don't think like when Asterix comics were being written, for instance, I don't think like Goskini and others or whoever those two guys were like who wrote and illustrated the things. I don't know whether they were sitting and like kind of talking to like history professors and trying to get all the specific details right. Even though interestingly now apparently in like I've heard from somewhere that in France I think like many of these Asterix comics are actually used in history lectures like in like history courses as material. So it can, I think it can, a good narrative actually can work the other way, where like you create a great story, it can eventually end up as part of some syllabus. But yeah, by kind of drawing like on a syllabus or kind of trying to kind of append that may not be the best sort of an approach. So I don't know. I mean, it's a, it's definitely a question to kind of think about. I like in hindsight, I'm sure I would have, like we would, and also without some of the sort of organizational constraints that were there, maybe we would have gone in a very different direction. Like if, for instance, it was an independent magazine that was created just by a bunch of writers and illustrators, maybe we would have kind of taken an extremely different approach. May not even had like a science advisory board or whatever. We would have maybe just picked topics that we were personally interested in and then try to do something fun out of that. But
Yeah.
again, to play
Sorry.
devil's advocate to that devil's advocate scenario, I think I also do think that, in design, it's something I always tell my students as well. I think constraints are also very good.
Important.
Like having
Correct.
constraints, yeah, like having constraints, I think, forces you to think creatively to kind of make things work within that. Like, we're kind of right now getting through to the end of like this publication design course, and so all these kids are kind of putting together like this magazine for themselves. Like they have this college magazine called White Space. So they're this one bunch of designers are kind of design students are putting together the next issue of that, and they each have like their own spread, and every spread is like completely wildly different. So one of the things I have to then, this devil's advocate thing, I have to go in and say, listen, what if like you had only one typeface to work with and you had only black and white to work with, like how would you be creative within that kind of thing? And I think that is like, it's much more challenging in many ways, but it's also much more fun, and you end up with much more interesting results than if you had access to every color, every typeface, every layout possibility, and then like it's just this explosion. Though the other side of it works as well. So I don't know. I mean, it's a hard question to answer, but I
It's
think the
complicated.
answer
Like
is, yeah,
it's
it's
complicated.
complicated.
It's
I
complicated.
don't
It's
know, I
life.
think is the answer.
Yeah, but I mean, there are two things I want to pick up on. One, obviously, is talking about the kids that you kind of work with. But before we
Yeah.
get there, something that you mentioned that I relate to quite, I think, quite a bit, which is the world that is so interconnected. If anyone has talked to a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, you realize after the third why or the fourth why, you've completely changed the conversation structure. So you started
Yeah.
talking about one thing, and then you're maybe 5 worlds removed away from where you started.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that shows how the mind is. We self-impose constraints, which is good because it forces critical thinking, or
Yeah.
pressure tests your thinking style. But on the other hand, if left unconstrained, the human mind kind of wanders, and it kind of wanders less as we grow older, I think, in some fashion for most of us. And striking that balance, or riding the third rail, as they call it, between these
Yeah.
two
Yeah.
two extremes of human behavior, I think is where probably where most of the magic happens. I want to touch upon, speaking about 4-year-old angry kids, Angry Akku,
Mm.
and and the story there, because it's kind of fascinating. We talked about the design process overall, and I'm kind of
Yeah.
like narrow focused to kind of, we talked about brainwave as a format, but again, it's a lot of experts coming together. It's a melting pot across multiple concepts, multiple storylines, multiple story arcs, multiple worlds, all kind of changing with each release. But when it comes to Angry Akku, it is a singular book. What was the
Yeah.
story behind that? And I find that fascinating for a couple of reasons. One, again, it deals with the complexity of human emotions from the view of a child. Anyone
Yeah.
who's had a young child knows the extremes ups and downs that we kind of used on a daily basis. And what's really
Yeah.
fascinating, well, not fascinating but interesting for me, is that it ended up in the Nobel Peace Museum. And I wanted to know the story behind that. Like how does an Indian story about an angry kid, like how did that come to be, and how did it end up in the in the Nobel Peace Museum? Like what is that, what is the story behind that?
So the Nobel Museum thing was just I mean I don't know actually it wasn't I think any part of my doing really I'll answer that first because we'll get that out of the way. The Esther Duflo who was one of the economics laureates, like she was actually working with the Pratham Foundation, and this was sort of like a sister organization ish to like Pratham Books, which is the publishing company. So I think and she had been working with them for a while, and I think they kind of wanted to. When Esther Duflo was given the Nobel Prize, I think the Nobel Museum has how it works essentially is every year, the laureates are asked to kind of give these artifacts, which are in some way related to their work, which are then sort of kept in the museum for posterity as their contribution to the thing. And so she picked like I think three books, which were published by Pratham Books. And one of which was Angry Akku, this book. And I think maybe it was at that point I think it was purely based on like the fact like I think just how many of these copies were sort of out there and being read, and even that I think was a factor of like internally they used to have these big sort of reading marathon kind of events every year,
Hmm.
and Angry Akku was that year. I think it was part of this one of these big
Okay.
reading events that happened. So it just sort of like snowballed into this thing and then ended up over there. But it
So
began as a thing
it's a
where
right, sorry, it's a right time, right place kind of
that's what I think.
coincidence kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
very much so.
It'll be good. I mean, if I were you, I'd try to find out the story because it'll be really nice if there's something else to it. If she had a
Yeah,
4-year-old niece that read it, or probably too abstract an example, but I was just curious about
it
how that
is
specific
very
book
much
landed
modeled
up.
on a 4-year-old niece actually. So so Akku actually, I mean, so I have a niece called Akira, and like the kid in that is essentially sort of modeled on her at that point. Though she was far from being an angry kid, she was a very sweet kid. But
So you drew it to a logical extreme.
yeah, kind of. So I mean that kind of came about because these so how a lot of these children's publishers work is they have on the one hand they have a large part of their like catalog which is dedicated to like general books that authors propose or editors just sort of solicit, and like they're just great stories, like fun stories or whatever. Then they have certain things which are like needs that they have to fulfill like within the market, where like there are very specific areas, like for instance, you have alphabet books that will teach kids how to teach kids the alphabet, like, and then you have like multilingual books that are helping kids sort of navigate between two languages or whatever it is. There's a whole lot of different ways in which and you have science books that are talking about science concepts in a simple way. These guys wanted to start a series which was on emotional intelligence. And so they asked me if and I think because I had a sort of a background in doing this kind of thing where like also because of brainwave and stuff, and in fact going all the way back to like the first picture book that I made, like just fresh out of college, the first book that I made was actually a science. Again, it was a story that was built around like a science concept where like I kind of talked about gravity by using a seesaw as a device, as like a narrative device. So so I had some experience in doing that, kind of creating like using these narrative elements to kind of tell these kind of concepts. So they asked if I would do something related to emotional intelligence. And so I kind of looked at this thing of anger, because because as grown-ups, we all sort of now we have all these methods of sort of dealing with anger. You if you fly off the handle or whatever it is, you know that okay, you have to like there are ways in which you meditate or do your mindfulness practice or go and exercise or whatever it is, however you're kind of dealing with it. Kids, I think, there's a lot of sort of, unchanneled anger where you don't like, you don't know how to direct it, and it kind of goes out, flies out in all different ways. And, and then like they often get blamed for this thing where it's only because, they end up kind of throwing something or breaking something or whatever. And then parents will feel bad, and, maybe others will blame them for doing something bad. But then at the base of it is just like this sort of uncontrolled anger that maybe if it was channeled in a particular way, it could have been resolved in a more sort of equanimous way. So I kind of did a little bit of reading on, from reading of like a bunch of these essays and things that were written by child psychologists on how anger is resolved. And the process is fairly straightforward, which is essentially, you first check to see if they're hangry, like in the sense of like, are they hungry and like, are they thirsty or hungry or whatever it is. And you solve that first, because often that's just the case. They're just hungry. That's why they kind of, and that manifests as anger, or if they're tired or whatever it is. So resolve those, and then you kind of see if there are any deeper issues. Was there an incident like earlier today that kind of set this off or whatever? And of course, I'm not talking about. I mean, this is for a broader segment. I'm not talking about like very specific like psychological like issues or whatever it is, or I'm not talking about people who may kids who may fall on a certain emotional spectrum or whatever it is, because there are deeper challenges, and I think there
Yes.
one has to work with like a clinical psychologist. But this book is just simply at a very broad level, in a very general sense. So then you see if there was an inciting incident that kind of made the kid angry, and then you kind of try and resolve that. And then finally, I think it's this idea of creative catharsis, like sort of in a cathartic way, kind of getting the anger out by kind of engaging in some kind of a creative activity. So you can paint or draw or dance or whatever it is, and kind of like sing or whatever, and kind of get that out. So it's a very straightforward process, and to my mind, this book was also very, very straightforward. It just begins with an
Mm.
angry kid, and then who's being taken home by her father. And along the way, like this kid is just angry at everything, and then the father first feeds her some vadas and like some buttermilk and things like that. And then kind of just asks her if anything happened in school. Then something did happen in school, so he kind of tries to resolve that. And then in the end, kind of gives her some drawing material to draw with and so on. Very basic, very straightforward. I didn't think much would come out of this book, but I as you're saying, it's the right place, right time kind of thing. Because that book, yeah, I think it kind of started getting like the Pratham Books is a massive like publishing organization where these books are sort of sold at a very low cost to schools everywhere, particularly to low cost primary schools like
Mm.
government schools and things like that. So it went out as part of their kind of thing and went to a lot of schools. And I think in those schools it did kind of help a fair bit, because that was the first sort of place where it found some element of success,
Mm.
because I started getting teachers writing to me from various places, and people who are like part of these Teach for India things and so on, writing to me and saying, listen, this has been, we've been using your book and it's working really well. But because a lot of these low cost schools, like there are a lot of these kids who of like laborers and people like that, who kind of aren't earning a lot. They live really tough lives, and then often what happens is they live, like obviously they live paycheck to paycheck, and when the paycheck comes in, often these people are in like in such a sort of terrible emotional state that they may be alcoholic or drinking or whatever, and then they coming back home and taking it out on the kids or family or whatever. And so all these kids, like a lot of these kids were very troubled. They
Mm.
naturally had a lot of anger in them, which
Right.
is, because I mean, like we are, I mean, it's a deeply unequal society here. So like, and these people really sort of bear the brunt of it, and these kids were really being affected. And I think, having something that was kind of relatable, I think that was working at that level. But then of course, they had this reading. I keep forgetting the name. It's There's some reading challenge or something that they had this big kind of thing, and I think that was one of the first years when they just kind of started it off. So I think because of which they kind of included a bunch of these Bollywood actors to kind of as readers for
Right.
these books. So they picked two books to kind of read. One was a book by the writer Meera Ganapati, and the other was this Angry Akku, like my book. And so yeah, there were these like Bollywood like actors and actors, like kind of reading this book, and that kind of had a snowball effect, and it became like a big sort of a thing. But I mean, it was a fairly straightforward book, and maybe it was because of that sort of popularity, which was largely pushed by Pratham Books' sort of this big marketing mechanism that they had. That maybe that's why it ended up like in Esther Duflo's hands. I don't know. But
Yeah.
as far as things that I've written, I think it was a very utilitarian book.
But I mean
It
that's why I
served the
find, but
purpose.
that true, but I mean it's interesting the way life kind of plays out, right? Something that
Yeah,
you view as utilitarian can
yeah,
resonate so deeply in like you said, the brainwave seems as a creative endeavor a far more complicated thing to do, but something like Angry Akku, which is in your mind as a designer, as a creator, a fairly straightforward exercise, really
yeah.
lands very differently, and then goes to show you that you really don't know how things are received.
Oh, very true. Yeah,
It might be something really simple, but it speaks to something, I guess, so human in us. And anyone who's had a child who's gone through this phase is
yeah,
instantly relatable. And even though it might seem super evident, check if they're hungry,
yeah,
ask them if something happened during the day,
yeah,
and find a way for them to creatively take that anger out, whether it's spinning like a top, or running like a
yeah,
mad person, or screaming, or or kicking a ball. Um, it's something that I think any parent relates with, and that's probably the reason why I guess it landed so well. I'm sure the Bollywood thing played a role in it, but that's great for PR value. But
yeah.
you wouldn't be getting the kind of messages from teachers and I guess parents
Yeah.
just because a Bollywood star kind of read about it, right? There has to
No,
be
no,
something
I'm
foundational
very
about it.
grateful. I have to say. I mean, maybe I think I'm possibly I sounded a bit churlish while I was talking about this, but I'm extremely grateful for everything that happened, and I'm so glad that it's people are using it in a meaningful way. I just wish that some of this some of this could be diverted to some of my more niche books, which are which are like kind of little more lyrical, little nicer, more the kind of things that the kind of stories that I like organically as as a writer want to tell. But those are the ones that end up kind of like not getting very visible. But maybe I think there's a lesson in that in that I think the broader lesson probably is that if you are actually solving a problem that you know like society at large is sort of dealing with, then then I think that probably is a better way of pushing your time, I suppose. I don't know.
Market signals will tell you everything you need to know about
Yeah,
that, right?
really. Yeah,
And it's
yeah,
perfectly okay writing for a niche because you're doing it to, I guess, satisfy a creative itch.
yeah.
I mean, famously, well, not so famously. My daughter yesterday was asking me for some random toy, and she didn't know what she wanted. And her basic approach to this was just show me a bunch of things. I'll tell you what I want when I see it. Right. I think that philosophy translates pretty well to everything in life. Right. We don't know really what we want.
That's
The things that
classic.
we want, the things that we know, we think we want, are probably not the things that we want.
Yeah,
People want are not the things that people actually end up wanting. And I guess it translates literally into your creative babies not getting the same kind of, I
yeah.
guess, eyeballs that very basic Angry Aku books do. But then I guess that's life.
Yeah, there's definitely a lesson in there for me. Yeah, I have to unpack it a little bit. Maybe that's the kind of stuff I need to focus more on.
So I think that's a great segue over to the next generation of babies. And for people who are listening to this on audio, I'm kind of air quoting. No
Yeah,
disrespect. It's the kids that you teach. And I say kids because I think we're old enough to call them kids.
yeah, yeah, very much. I mean, listen, we're like a good 20
Uh,
years older than more than 20
Yeah,
years
so I
older
think so I think we have some liberties there.
Yeah,
How is the design discipline changed from when you kind of graduated from school? Because it's in a way come a full circle, right? So you
yeah,
studied design, you studied a lot of a lot of the core foundational things that you're teaching today, you've
Yeah,
kind of had the opportunity to, across different, as you said, multimodal formats, kind
yeah,
of develop that muscle, even though
yeah,
music is a fairly new one for you.
yeah.
How do you see that now back in the classroom as the one teaching? What's changed? Has anything changed?
Oh, I mean, everything has changed. I think. So the thing is, this thing of like talking about multidisciplinary and so on. I mean, back then that wasn't a requirement. Firstly, you could
Yeah.
specialize. You could go down one stream and comfortably kind of stay in that stream for the rest of your life. Now, if you look at like the average sort of JD, like the job description like, out there for like designers, they want you to do everything. Like,
Mm,
every designer, every young designer who is being hired like has to be like a good graphic designer, has to be a good like a videographer, and like, has to understand social media, has to, be able to edit, and a whole bunch of things. So expectations have changed a fair bit, I think,
mm,
as the world itself has sort of moved towards this multidisciplinary kind of a thing. And I think as social media has also pushed things in a certain way. But I think, there's a lot more pressure on these kids now, compared to how things were back then. I do think things were a lot easier. A, because just the sheer number of designers who are out there now versus what it was back then. Because back then we had maybe four or maximum five design schools in India. And I'm assuming that, I mean, maybe that's like that follows a certain trend around the world as well. I don't know, but in India at least we had only four or five design schools, and which meant that I think the number of fresh graduates that were coming out every year would have been probably like I think maybe not more than about, 100, 200 people new every year, 200 to 300 people at most. Now you have, that's the, like, now you have, I mean, some hundreds of design schools everywhere. And then each of these design schools, like in a year, the intake is like, is like 250, 300 students in a year. Like the college I teach at, the intake is now like around 300. Whereas, in my batch, in like when the foundation batch, when I joined college, was like 25 people, I think, or 20 28 or something like that. So that's like, an exponential increase in the number of people who are, and so I can't even imagine like the number of students who are out there right now. Like, I mean, fresh graduates who are looking for jobs. And then, of course, I mean, the elephant in every room right now, which is AI, has kind of changed things in a massive way, because what AI has done essentially is, in there's this sort of period of like, I think about 5 to 10 years in which you're sort of building your skills, where you're making mistakes. You're kind of working under people, and they kind of give you room to make mistakes as well. They carry a little bit of that load and kind of let you kind of experiment a little bit. There's a mentorship kind of, period in the first 5 or 10 years, where you're working under senior designers, and you help them with the smaller tasks, and then you kind of learn on the job and get better as you go along. That part of the process, I think, has been kind of taken out by generative AI now, because what generative AI is doing is it's kind of doing that, like that job, the job of the junior designer, in many ways, which means that, I think what the design, which is why I think, and which is probably one of the reasons why a designer now needs to know everything and do everything, so that like the parts of the job that are now being outsourced to AI can be kind of, like maybe they can focus on other areas. I don't know. I really don't know how it works, but it seems like there's a lot of pressure, because A, they don't know where their jobs are coming from, and when they do have the job, do they have the kind of luxury of like learning skills slowly over the course of 5 or 10 years that we all had. As I was saying, this like the process is essentially the same, and it is an iterative kind of process in learning these skills. But then time is a big factor in all of this. So I had the luxury of like learning a lot of these skills on the job over the course of like 10, 15 years, which I don't know like now, whether they do have that kind of a thing. So yeah, it has changed considerably, and I do kind of sense that pressure, like even when I'm in the classroom, from the students as well, and often I think they also sort of question, very rightly so, like they question the relevance of a lot of the things that are being taught as
mm,
well, because are some of these. sort of core disciplines even relevant anymore. When we're kind of talking about like the nitty-gritties of like typography and saying, like, and how you move this thing like a couple of pixels this way, and so that you align it in this way and this and that and whatever, based on certain like tried and tested concepts. Like maybe like another year they're just going to like prompt when they're out there, like they're going to use a prompt to kind of get all that figured out, like left align all the content on this, and then make sure that the visual balance is correct, and then the AI does it for them. Maybe that's where they're headed into, and like, so are we kind of wasting that time? So these are relevant questions to be asking, I think, even from a uh, curriculum building side of things. But at the same time, I feel like if we're not kind of teaching these things in college, then where are they going to learn it? And like the apocalyptic, like the sort of the scenario, basically, I think like my dystopian future scenario is like, what if the undersea cables are cut or whatever, and suddenly the internet goes off or whatever, and then like how are these guys going to learn how to do these
How
things?
will we survive? All right. No, but I mean, it's very valid questions, and I think it is, we're living through a very complicated time in our lives. There's massive disruption, and just when you
Yeah,
think you're getting settled, the ground shifts under your feet yet again, and it's
yeah,
happening so often and at such a rapid pace. I think a lot of people are struggling to find their footing, as it were, and especially in the context of design. No, speaking about generative AI,
yeah,
is it a question of now people moving to away from being creators in its purest sense, and I'm not talking about creators in the context of content creators online, but creators as design, creators of design, unique of unique art and unique language, unique
yeah.
books and articles and stuff like that, to someone who's more an orchestrator. And that's what I'm thinking, because these tools essentially are a way for you to kind of orchestrate. You can still get the end output,
Yeah.
but the creative
Mm.
process is no longer as clunky as you articulated earlier in our conversation, which is it's an iterative, make a lot of mistakes, go down paths you had not thought about. This way you get tactically to an answer, whatever that is, a lot faster, a lot more
Mm.
efficiently. But then the question then becomes, is efficiency the main objective, especially in
Yeah.
the context
Yeah.
of design as a as a specialization.
Also, whose idea of efficiency? I think that's the question to be asked. I think I used to have a lot of resentment when these generative AIs first came out, and I used to kind of like I don't use them at all. So and because I kind of like in certain areas at least I've honed my skills enough to a point where I just prefer to use like techniques that I already have in place, rather than because it doesn't really get me the results that I may kind of imagine in my head. The big thing for I think most like visual like people in the visual arts, I think the big thing is always, are you able to accurately convey what you have in your mind, like on paper, in a sort of relatively direct way. And over time, I think I've gotten better at it. So I still find like generative, I don't use them at all, but I think I feel personally, I feel there's a lot of
I
value
just
to
want to,
process. Sorry. Yeah.
yes, I want to double click on that. So you
Yeah.
mentioned
Yeah.
something very interestingly, which is two things. As a concept, you want to stay away from it, but the second is that you do a far better job of translating what's in your head down on paper, right?
Yeah.
So is it a question of that, or the fact that philosophically you believe that you shouldn't be using it, or because you're a purist, or is it somewhere in the gray area between? Like why do you believe generative AI isn't something that you would use?
There's a bit of both. I mean, I do think there are like, ethical issues that need to be addressed for sure, which is that, like, for instance, when generative AI launched, I'm an early adopter in most cases. I enjoy using technology. I enjoy using new technologies, and I try and kind of pick them up as soon as they're out, and kind of, particularly if it's related to my field, I like kind of toying around with all these things. And I did, when Midjourney launched. I think the first 2 or 3 days I kind of signed on to that beta thing and I kind of used it a few times. I had like projects running at that point and I thought, okay, maybe this can, help as a sort of visualization tool. Like there's this, for example, there was this one illustration I was doing which was kind of set on in this sort of coastal village in England. This was for this science fiction magazine so this was like an illustration that was going to go along with this short story that someone had written and obviously I don't know what a coastal like English town looks like because I've been to the UK but I've not been to a coastal town aside from like if you can call London a coastal town then I don't know but like I haven't I haven't been anywhere like to one of those places so I don't know what it looks like I have no clue so and then I started looking at like image references and but then there were certain things that were lacking so I thought okay maybe let me try out this new technology and see what it looks like and the results it produced were like kind of crap and I was like okay maybe this will get better as time goes on whatever let it kind of thing but I didn't know at that point what how it worked at all so I started
Mm,
reading the first few days about how this whole thing worked and then over the first few weeks, there were all these revelations of where the data sets came from. So my thing was like, I think I would have actually been okay with these things existing and, whatever, and like people using them the way they're using it. If, for instance, the data sets were entirely constructed of out of copyright material. And that's very easy to do
mm,
because, human history spans like 200,000 years or whatever it is. But like our like copyright thing expires like 60 years ago so anything from
mm,
beyond 60 years is actually like is there for the taking. So and all of that can actually build a really rich and textured kind of data set. Why not just use that? Why do you have to use what was happening was a lot of the content that was being put into these data sets was of like living artists and exact styles were being replicated and people I knew in even I that like people I personally know in the illustration and industry and in literature and so on their work was being sort of used for this and sort of replicated and they were losing out on work because of it and I think it did sort of industry wide it kind of created a lot of resentment as well but in a situation where as it is illustrators in general don't get compensated very well I mean the pay scales are pretty low you really have to hustle to make a living and I think a lot of people who are sort of senior in the industry had really hustled for years and years to get to a place where things were happening like in my own case my first sort of international projects had just sort of happened over the last like 2 years before up to those 2 years of like when generative AIs had kind of come along, and I just started getting recognized. Like there were like I was being nominated for like some awards and this and that, and then suddenly it all disappeared. Everything went away
mm.
because this kind of came in. So there was, I mean, there was that side of things, but whatever that like maybe at some level that couldn't be avoided. But I think what could have been avoided was like the data sets where was being like taken from. I think that was one ethical kind of issue that I did have with it. Sorry, what was the other part of the question that you had asked? So that
No,
was
no, basically, essentially, w- w- in your mind, was it a function of the technology was not good enough? It couldn't visualize what was in your head,
oh
or a
right, yeah, yeah,
function
yeah,
of
yeah,
ethical considerations? Clearly, on the ethical side, but what if, and
yeah.
it obviously didn't also translate anywhere close to what was in your head or down on paper.
So that's the other thing, So I do have something to say on that, which is that for me process is actually like really important, and I think one side of it is that like the process will obviously if you do it well enough, it can kind of take what you imagine and kind of put it down onto in a physical form in a very efficient way if you're good enough. But the other like side of it is, I mean, you're talking about how process is messy, and I love that about like the artistic, like the creative process, because the messiness of it like creates, these happy accidents that kind of take you off into like different tangents that you may not have explored initially, and it'll get you into these and maybe your artwork will end up in a place that you hadn't sort of considered at all when you started out and I find that all the time even when I'm writing a short story or whatever it is I have a fairly clear kind of a like a structure in mind to begin with But then as I write it and as the character kind of, becomes more fleshed out, suddenly the character might make a decision that I hadn't thought of, or like go off into a different space. And that may, kind of take the entire story in a direction that I had never considered. And I think what happens when you kind of prompt something to like give you a result is that it's giving you a finished result.
Yep.
It's taking away the middle part of like that bridge, and it's kind of directly dropping you to the other side. And what it does in that process, I feel, is it kind of removes all these other considerations that might have developed, like if you had followed the traditional process. Like you're not at all considering a whole bunch of other possibilities. Like you have been given this sort of preset kind of a like a thing. This one possibility has been given to you in a nice, neatly packaged way, and suddenly you stop thinking about everything else. So now, and then that's the path that you're going to go take going forward. I don't know. This is maybe I'm not kind of maybe there are other people who perfected this process and kind of I want to leave some room for doubt there. I don't know. Because I don't use these AIs. I don't know how whether whether I'm misunderstanding the process. But for me, I put a lot of value in like the sketching aspect of things, like just sketching a lot for like in the visual art kind of thing, but also also in just writing. Like I just copiously, like I still take notes all the time on paper by like I have tons of notebooks all over the place. And I just like writing by hand. And I think sometimes organically there's a lot that comes up in that process which just doesn't, like if I were to just take that same line and then kind of prompt it, and then I have this thing, suddenly my mind just goes into that and I stop thinking about everything else. Whereas when I'm that slow process of sitting and writing, I don't know, it just kind of takes me in all kinds of interesting directions. So there's that part of it as well, you know.
And and
Um,
and, and
does
you
that
you're
make sense?
mentioning obviously no, it absolutely does, and I guess
Yeah,
the human condition is a complex one, right? As they say. So we're 8 billion and change people in the world, and not everyone thinks
definitely.
the
Yeah,
same. Actually, most people think very differently. But
yeah,
it could also be a function of the creator mentality versus the consumer or the market mentality. So what you're talking about is the process of creation, and
yeah,
I know it's difficult to, because everything is so interwoven. It's difficult to kind of create clean breaks between life, especially because livelihoods are involved. So I completely get the aspect of the market moving to a point where it's disrupting people's livelihoods. So that is,
right.
in a way, nothing to do with, if you think about it very clinically, it has nothing to do with the creator process. It's basically the market has
Yeah,
moved on and
you're
certain
right.
skill
You're
sets are
right.
no
Yeah,
longer valuable, right? So if I look at it purely from that clinical cold perspective, and that
yeah,
that has happened every single time, I think the human beings have evolved, right? You move from an agrarian
true.
economy to an industrial economy, and then to the computer age, and so on. There were a lot of industries that were left en masse, on the side of the road, not fun for them at all. And I think we're going through that phase today. The only difference is that I think the creative, because of generative AI, the creative industry was the tip of the spear. I think your industry, if I can say your, felt the brunt of it first and
Yeah,
earliest. What you're seeing now is a far more vociferous opposition, because there are other industries
yeah,
that are
yeah.
being
Vibe
affected en
coding and
masse.
all of that stuff. That's yeah going
Yeah,
on.
massive
Yeah,
industries and massive
yeah,
layoffs in all
yeah,
the sectors. So there's inherently a
yeah.
lot of noise in this space. But if you go back to what you basically said, I'm trying to kind of unpack the problem, as it were,
Mm.
is that creatively you still have the avenues you have, right? Which is, you can still take a pen and pencil and you can still write and you can still create art. The market again will determine where the value is, and cynically, that's the way it's always been in a capitalist kind of society, which is, where do I make money? And I think the bigger question is the question of authenticity, which is,
Yeah,
one,
yeah,
what
absolutely.
do you define as authentic? Because even without computers, you had human beings that parody others. Like, I mean, you have
Mm.
people who copied great designers in the past, where
Mm.
your literary style also evolves as a function of the great authors you've read as part of your career. Everything influences us. We're a sum of our parts, right? Of all our
Sure.
experiences
Yeah,
in
yeah,
life kind of form a unique kind of individual. So I think
yeah.
the question more broadly, at least for me, is, can you differentiate authentic versus inauthentic? And the second question is, does the market really care?
Yeah.
so so so
Well,
so 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 and
the second
that's
question
a
is
sad
easier to
reality.
answer. I think the market
So
probably doesn't care.
well, I need
Maybe
to
not.
push
I
back
don't
on that.
know.
I think certain aspects of the market do care. It depends on what format.
Right.
For example, you have generative AI content like videos and all, which are so hyper real on
Yeah.
flooding all these Instagram reels. But
Yeah.
there's a reason why in my small little bubble, the podcast world, the long form has a certain function, right? People listen to really long conversations, and one of the reasons I started this is human beings with all their imperfections in this conversation is
Yeah.
not impossible, but kind of difficult to replicate with AI. And I
Yeah.
place a value on that kind of content. So it
Yeah.
might be a
Yeah.
niche, it might be a small subsection. Most people are happy with 10-second reels, which are AI generated.
Yeah.
But yeah, just food for thought. At least I'm also double clicking on this conversation as you're talking about it.
No, no, you'd be surprised. I think, I mean, in the sense that, I mean, or maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but like conversations like this, I have a long commute to college, and it takes me about an hour and a half to get there. And each way, like it's just podcasts like this that I just put on one really long podcast, and then I kind of listen to it the whole way through. And I like that. I like the little imperfections. I like the random tangents that people take. I like the fact that, you start at a certain place, and then you end up somewhere completely different. And I think that is like that messiness of like being human is what really sort of translates in many ways as, what is authentic, I guess. And I think that is for me also, how I think about not the market consideration side of things, the other side of things, like, authenticity in general, as a like as a creative person or whatever. I think uh, like this question of whether it's the same when like a data set is fed into a generative AI versus all the influences and all the things that you've been reading and watching and so on, that kind of ending up in what you are writing. I think there is a distinction to be made, because this, on the one hand, I think of it sort of like as almost like a glorified search engine in a way, but it's basically collating a bunch of things, and in a very mechanistic way, it's kind of producing a thing based on a prompt. I don't think the human mind works the same way, because the question is, so what is the quality of the filter, right? Because in each case there is a filter. Like the generative AI is a filter that's filtering all of this and kind of putting something out at the end, like a distilled kind of a thing. Like as humans, we are also filters. Like we are kind of filtering a whole bunch of things and then putting it out there. But the how we I think how we are different as filters is that, on the one hand, there is all this knowledge and information that we are, and in that regard we are similar, maybe, to these algorithms. But I think where we are dissimilar is that, at the same time, as filters, we are also filters of like experiences that we've had. We've like we have lived experience. Like we've kind of lived life a certain way. We've had all these sort of interactions with different people. We have a certain emotional sort of life going on, and there's a way in which there's a perspective and a way in which we see the world. And I think that really counts for something, which I think that like that the computer doesn't give you, in the sense that it like the way the like light is filtering through my window, through the curtain, and kind of landing in a certain place or whatever it is. And then when I think about that, maybe it kind of resonates in a like and kind of like there's a memory that I think of, which like maybe something 15 years ago, there was another space where the light filtered the same way, and then that makes me think of something else, and then I kind of collate some of these and kind of create like a piece of writing that kind of, maybe I write a poem about it or whatever it is. But these are unique experiences that are unique only to me, that I'm kind of using language and expressive words to kind of combine and kind of create something out of. And I don't know whether a generative AI is going to be able to bring that in, because there's a sensory aspect to it, right? Like we are like feeling sort of sensory kind of people. Like I think, and so the way we see things, the way we smell things, touch things, and whatever, all of that is building into a certain broad experience that we have, and the personality that we have, and so on. So we as filters in that sense, I think we are a lot more complex and much more layered, I think, than these sort of things that are just sort of compressing and, putting it out there. I
True.
don't, this is my feeling.
No, no, no. You're right. I mean, like I said, everyone has a perspective on it. It also depends on your context, how you process information, your rubric of what is ethical and what is not. So we're complicated beasts. All our decisions, it's a multifactored data set that goes into every decision that we take, even though it's unconscious or not, right? So conscious or unconscious decision. The way I look at generative AI is it's another tool. Just the way I
Sure.
learn to
Yeah.
speak, the way I learn to write. And you're right. I'm sure there are a significant number of people who and there's no shortage of, I mean, it's literally not even a meme now, where people can immediately sense on LinkedIn or Facebook which content or posts or comments are AI generated, because it is just so, it's become so evident. It's just so
Yeah.
good. It's so, like I said, the very nature of the fact that it's so polished
Yeah.
itself is in a way not human,
No, I
right?
have to say
So I think
I have a lot of resentment on that front as well, because now people are saying if you use an M dash, it's like it looks like it's AI generated. I've been using M dashes all my life, and I write in fully formed sentences. I use my punctuation correctly, like I mean as we were taught to do in school, and like I do all of that, and now people may think that an AI wrote it, which is annoying. Why? Like it's like
I'm
perfection is
guessing.
also.
So you're probably where the AI hopes to be. We're all still lagging far behind your writing skills. We're all playing catch
No,
up.
that's objectively not true, Arjun. I think I like we. I mean, so I don't know if people listening to this may not know this, but we actually did study together. Like we were we were in the same school, and we did have a pretty decent
Yeah,
English
we did.
education
We
in
did
that sense.
foundational knowledge.
Yeah,
Well, some people
yeah.
absorb more
And
than the others, clearly.
come on, It's just-
So
that is
the point I'm trying
BS.
to make is that
That's yeah,
the
yeah,
generative AI as a tool, it depends on
yeah.
how you use it, right? So for me, I
No,
use
sure,
it
sure. You're right. I mean, yeah, yeah,
as a sparring partner. So the way I look
yeah.
at it
Okay.
is, um, so I don't look at it to replace foundational experiences that I have. We are fortunate enough to have grown through that phase where we've had 20 years of building those foundational experiences
Yeah,
that were grounded in reality, good and bad, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
that is still the formative data set that I operate, that all of us used to operate to take decisions on a day-to-day basis. The way I
yeah,
look at generative AI is a sparring partner or multiple sparring partners that I can turn on and turn off, dial up and dial down, depending on
yeah,
what I want to accomplish as an end objective. If you go
yeah.
into using generative AI, and I know a lot of people, well, a fair bit of people use it as input, get the
Mm,
output and use it verbatim, then
mm,
absolutely yes, you're not using your creative faculties as you could be using them. I'm not saying you
mm,
should be using
mm.
them. If someone wants to do it that way, you know,
Yeah.
no judgment on that, but it's the function of can you level up, can you elevate the way you think. So give you a classic example. um, because there's only so much of life experience that I can cram in, or any human can cram in, based
Mm,
on where you were, who you worked with. It's a finite set. 8 billion people. We've all
yeah,
had unique experiences. I
yeah,
can't gain the experiences or perspectives of someone else. But
yeah.
using generative AI, I can proxy that. I can say,
Right,
pressure test this thinking of mine. Take me
right.
down avenues that I might have not thought. I might
Yeah,
not go down those avenues, but as
yeah,
a sparring partner, as a conversation like we're doing right now,
yeah,
I can
yeah,
have this going 10 times, 20 times. And that's the way I use it. And
yeah,
then I take in all this input, obviously do my own research on the side. And
yeah.
I think of it as it's like having 10 good researchers working with you. That's probably an
Right,
analogy that
right.
probably lands better. And if you use it in that point of view, then the output is still yours. It's
Yeah,
just that you've kind of 10x the pipelines into your thinking to allow
yeah.
you to form an opinion that might be slightly different than if you had just operated on the subset of knowledge that you had accumulated over the 20 years of lived experience. That's the way I kind of approach it.
Yeah, I mean,
Not
fair
obviously
enough. And
peddling visual style as my own,
yeah,
but
yeah. No,
that's
no,
the way.
no. Yeah, I mean, it's a completely fair point, and I take your point, and I think it's well made. I agree with you, and I think uh, anyone who's using it in that way, like, more power to them. I do like the only thing I just worry about, how things are going to look like 10 years from now, because I think I'm not worried for like our generation and maybe older,
That's
because
the
we,
point. Great. Yes,
yeah,
that's the point. Yes.
I'm worried about like future generations who may get over reliant on this, which because they do sort of,
Correct.
warn about things like sort of, broad sort of, cognitive degradation in society and things like there are researchers who are actually writing papers on this, and they're kind of looking at how generative AI has been affecting, like ChatGPT in particular, has been affecting a lot of people and their thinking. And I see, I see it like I see the kids who I'm teaching and so on doing this as well. You like everyone has their laptop open in front of them in class. No one's taking notes anymore. And then if any question is asked, it's instantly like to like chat GPT, and it's just it's weird. I mean, for me, I really I like every day feels like a Black Mirror episode. So it just so I don't know what it's going to look like 10 years from now. So I really worry on that front. But yeah, I'm not worried for us. I think, and I think that, and that's a fair way in which to use it. I've been hearing about many like interesting ways it's being used in science as well to kind of I mean these AIs in general to kind of model certain scenarios.
Find
And there's a
patterns
lot
that
of
human beings can't,
yeah,
or
exactly, yeah.
process
All that is great.
patients at massive volumes. Yeah,
Yeah.
and you're right. And I think thank you for making the leap for me, because that was the segue to the end, which is
Right.
which is exactly that. Which is, I'm not worried for our generation,
Yeah.
because I think I don't have the data on this, but I think most people at our age or above still view it with a fair bit of skepticism. We will be
Mm.
pressure tested to get the answer that we want, or discard it entirely because we believe, yeah, that's not how I sound, or that's not what I don't believe this, or yeah, I can push back on an AI. And you're right. If I'm worried, I'm hoping it's a not a it's a misplaced worry, but that's the reason I'm having
Mm.
conversations with you, people who teach the next generation, is that
Yeah.
in our generation, maybe 5 out of every 100 go straight from prompt answer to, that's exactly what I'm going to say, or that's the way I think, to, 80% of the people going down that process where they're not using generative AI or AI tools as as a way to pressure test their own thinking critically, and they
Mm.
go straight to what the AI tells me is what I think, and the way I'm going to communicate. And you're exactly right, and that's I wouldn't say a heavy worry, because I don't think we're at that stage,
Yeah.
but I'm little concerned. But you're
Yeah, I
clearly
mean,
saying that in your
there've been all
classroom
these
you're seeing that happening.
comparisons. Yeah, I mean, I mean, socially, in a broad way, like the last few years, suddenly that that old film Idiocracy is sort of back again in the like general conversation. Everyone keeps talking about it, and I mean, it's not very far fetched to see that happening. Really, we already have an American president who kind of functions along the same lines as Terry Crews in that film, and society in general seems to be headed in that direction. I don't know. I don't see it as a the problem is this. I think it's not just AI on its own. I think there is this, in the last 10 years, it's also this sort of, this sort of 1-2 punch that's happened from between like social media and AI. So I think, that together is, I think, something that is something to be a bit wary about, because there's the younger generations, and how they're going to deal with like the cognitive load of like the world that we're kind of emerging into. The other side of it is also, what do you trust, like what information do you
Mm.
trust, because on the one hand AIs are hallucinating, so there's that, but then the other side of things is also like, with these photoreal images, and then like with in the political side of things, like how people are kind of using these hyperreal images to kind of push everything from like elections to like propaganda to create like kind of creating uh, narratives that kind of like justify wars to all of that. So I think what in a broad way, I think it's good that we're having this conversation, but I think this kind of conversation needs to be happening at a at a diplomatic level. Like there needs to be like ethics committees that governments are putting together to kind of look at what kind of an effect all of this is having on the social fabric. And we did that in the past with, like, the idea of human cloning, for instance, or whatever. Like, governments got together and discussed it, and that's the kind of thing that we need to be doing right now with AI.
Mm.
It's like, in my lifetime, for sure, like in our lifetimes, I've never seen a technology that has created like more disruptive change than AI. It's just
Agreed.
it's incredible, and there's no way to predict what is going to happen. Forget like 2 years from now, we don't know what is going to happen next month. So,
Right.
so it's just I don't know. I suppose there are two ways of looking at it. You can be highly positive and be very kind of like optimistic about the future, or maybe bat in the hatches and like prepare for
Or a bit of both, or a bit
yeah,
of
a bit of both, maybe.
very, very cautious optimism and
Yeah,
skepticism all baked together.
yeah,
On that cheery note, a full
yeah.
circle back to non-AI subjects.
Right.
What's next for you on the purely creative, non-technology space? What are you working on?
I'm working on. So I'm just like putting the finishing touches on this like short story collection. I hope to kind of send it off to my publisher in another month or so, and kind of like see where that goes. And then there's like a couple of novels I've been writing for years and years and years, which I need to do something about. And then I have a bunch of songs I'm working on, so I have to like finish like recording those. And yeah, I don't know, just bunch of different things. This month, and actually like the one big project is we're shifting houses, so we have to I have to like plan the whole shift, and then set up my studio at the new space, and that's the big thing. But other than
Mm.
that, yeah, a bunch of things, just like random personal
What are the
projects.
short stories in the books on?
These are sort of like, sort of broadly SFF, like, I mean, science fiction, fantasy, but like with a bit of horror, stuff like that, like in the speculative fiction kind of domain. There are like some of those stories are actually out there on the internet already. Like, it kind of collects a bunch of those, plus a bunch of new stories, and it's generally set somewhere between, like, Chennai and Bangalore, Madras and Bangalore
Hmm.
rather, like, because this it's like a slightly older kind of setting maybe. And yeah, there's some common elements between the stories, but broadly as SF, like, slightly twisted humor, that
Yeah,
kind of.
interesting.
I will send you
Definitely up
stuff.
my alley. Yes, please. And any Angry Akku version twos, or that you're
Oh.
working on?
That's a good question. I am actually, I mean, I have a series which I've been like, which I need, I'm still sort of, there's a series of like picture books which kind of go on this emotional intelligence kind of thing, not exactly Angry Aku kind of thing, but like building on those ideas. I don't know where that's going to hit. So, but yeah, there is something. I haven't put out any children's content in a while. Actually, I'm kind of very much out
Mm.
of that space. The last 2 3 years, I've been out of it. But yeah, I have stuff in the works.
Right.
Hopefully, it'll
So
happen
maybe,
soon.
well, maybe we park another episode for when that's out, because
That sounds
both
great.
subjects are very interesting.
Yeah.
The SFF stuff for sure. Please hit me up once you've got something out that's published.
Oh, for
Would
sure.
love to take a look at it.
I'll definitely send you a copy of that.
And the kid stuff. There's no
Yes.
shortage of a need for kids material in this house.
I hope
So
we
would love
still
to
have
do that.
readers in another few years.
Oh no, I
Anyway.
mean there are
Let's
a
not
lot of
go back
parents. You'd be
down that.
surprised by the number of parents that sit and read. We
Yeah,
enforce reading books before going to bed.
that's
Multiple
great.
books.
That's awesome.
It's just the process of visualizing the worlds that you have in the
Have
brain.
you have
The
you thought
child's
about writing something? Is that something that you considered?
not a skill set that of mine that would warrant getting it up to the level that it's worth publishing.
You never know. I
But
mean, I'm sure you're getting like insights into their minds like a lot more than any of us are. Like, I mean, who are non-parents, I think. And
But given the sheer number of parents there are in the world, I think there's no shortage of insights on kids.
okay.
You just need to have so insights on kids. You can ask any parent down the street. You can spit in a direction, you'll hit a parent that'll give you 100 insights on a kid. I think it's translating that into something that's meaningful and tangible, and more importantly, engaging. It also depends on the dynamic, right? We're at the age where
Right.
she's not reading by herself just as
Yeah,
yet,
yeah.
starting to, but we're telling
Let
her
me rephrase
stories.
that. I
Uh,
mean, To say that you are also very well read and articulate and all of that, and maybe you might find, and since you're also into like very much into like science fiction and fantasy and all of that, maybe you might find some kind of, I don't know, like some interesting stories emerging out of
Might
this
be.
period
You
in your
never
life.
know.
But yeah, never say
Never say
never. Yeah,
never. There's no
yeah,
shortage of material. I think it's more the will
yeah.
to execute something that's worthy
Well,
of getting
I
it
hope you
getting
find that
printed.
will. Yeah.
We shall see. Well, Vinayak, it was a wonderful conversation. Thanks again for taking
Hey,
the time.
likewise. Thank you so much, and thanks for all your very insightful questions. It gave me a lot to think about. So
Well, onwards and upwards, and we shall touch base the next time in Bangalore, or you're heading to
yeah,
Singapore. We should definitely catch up
for
for a
sure.
cuppa or a beer or whatever that is.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Sounds great.
Thanks a ton, man. Lovely speaking to you.
Thank you,
Cheers.
Arjun. Thanks a lot. Cheers.